He did.
Yes.
Richard Bissell mentioned the 1933 Magenta crash.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Exactly.
That is such corroboration, because that is a highly conflicted, account.
1933 was the first recovery in Europe, in Magenta, Italy.
I fully trust David Grush, but that's amazing that there's some corroboration from back then.
He mentioned it.
Wow.
Italian government moved it to a secure air base in Italy for the rest of kind of the fascist regime until 1944, 1945, and the Pope Pius XII back-channeled that.
So the Vatican was involved.
Yeah, and told the Americans what the Italians had, and we ended up scooping it.
So he said this. Yeah, he said this did not begin in you need to know the background. How did it end up that Truman transferred that object from Italy? The steps getting there was arranged by Allen Dulles. But that went back to what Pippa mentioned.
And he said the steps that Allen Dulles helped with the crash retrieval.
And remember, Allen Dulles, and so John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles are twins.
Yeah.
And John Foster Dulles is running the OSS, the precursor to U.S. intelligence, out of Switzerland. And then I said, Dad, why was he running it out of Switzerland? How the heck does that happen? And he said, well, everybody knew that he did it deliberately so that he would be beyond the reach of U.S. law.
Let me explain. After all these events a few years back, when I was still an official in the office of the trade representative, I was the principal. I was invited by, Switzerland doesn't have a president. The leader revolves around the canton of leaders. But whoever was the leader that year, I visited the government about several matters, and they said, would you like to see the office of Allen Dulles when he lived here? So I said, it'd be fascinating. Well, beautiful apartment overlooking the river. And we got talking. I said, how do you explain why he chose to be here? He said, that's simple. He told us when he got permission to maintain a very active office here that as long as he was in Switzerland, no American law could reach him as to something he did that was illegal, immoral, or otherwise in the United States. So he said he was here all the time, and it was to allow him a free hand to do the most terrible things if needed. Okay, that's understandable. He was a creepy guy. Now, going back to 1933, the relationship needs to be uncovered between Angleton's father, Angleton, and the Knights of Malta.
Wow.
Because the Knights of Malta had their long historical connection with the Vatican. And indeed have this special diplomatic status. You can have an international passport for the Knight. I forget what state. It's a sovereign state for a handful of people.
Yes.
But it's all connected with the Vatican.
According to multiple accounts, including UFO whistleblower David Grush, a disc-like object measuring roughly 10 to 12 meters in diameter came down near Magenta in Lombardy, Italy in June of 1933.
1933 was the first recovery in Europe.
Under Benito Mussolini's fascist regime, a total media blackout was imposed throughout the Stefani news agency. telegrams threatened severe penalties for any reporters who deviated from a government-ordered cover story attributing the event to a meteor. Despite the censorship, a special investigative body known as Gabinetto, or RS-33, formed to study the craft, with high-level figures such as Mussolini, Air Marshal Italo Balbo, and Nobel laureate and radio pioneer Marconi, believed to have been involved. Testimonies suggest that the downed craft and possibly 2 recovered bodies were taken to the SIAI Marchetti private aerospace hangars for intensive analysis. This secret research group reportedly drew up a 9-step protocol to manage the Magenta crash and any similar future incidents. The instructions included immediate site containment, arrests of all witnesses, and thorough disinformation campaigns to quell public attention. Sounds very similar to what happened in the United States after Roswell. Marconi, long fascinated by extraterrestrial possibilities, clashed with Mussolini's insistence that the subject must be of terrestrial origin. Some documents and later family confirmations indicate Marconi genuinely believed the craft could be non-human. In the late 1930s, Pope Pius XII became aware of the Magenta retrieval, reportedly fearing that any recovered technology might fall into Nazi hands once Italy allied with Germany. Through discreet channels, the Pope quietly informed the Allies about the craft's existence and storage location. This back-channel intelligence set the stage for the Office of Strategic Services, America's premier wartime intelligence gathering program, and the predecessor to the CIA in World War II, to intervene in northern Italy as the war approached its end. Working under a secret project called MacGregor, OSS operatives targeted advanced Axis technology, including the rumored crashed UFO. By 1945, the Americans had reportedly transferred the Italian UFO to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio for further study.
Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio.
Many of the top Nazi scientists, as a part of Operation Paperclip that the Allies had exfiltrated, also made their way to Wright-Patterson to work on the Magenta craft. Malta, as a sovereign territory with diplomatic immunity, would be the perfect international guardians of UFO secrecy. Initially, when Harold said the Knights of Malta were deeply embedded in the UFO story, I had no idea what to think. It sounded like a plotline from a Dan Brown or Umberto Eco novel. Secret society associated with the Vatican and the sovereign state of Malta governs UFO secrecy. Go figure. But not only were Hugh Angleton and James Jesus Angleton Knights of Malta, and remember, James Jesus Angleton seemed to be responsible for a lot of counterintelligence around UFOs that came out from the 50s to the 80s. But the bizarre Knights of Malta UFO connection runs even deeper after further research. Colonel Philip J. Corso, later famous for his claims regarding reverse engineering alien materials at the Pentagon in his book The Day After Roswell, served as a high-ranking intelligence officer in Italy during the post-war period. In fact, he was the personal liaison to the future pope. He was also a Knight of Malta. He was also a main figure in Operation Paperclip and helped create the quote-unquote rat lines exfiltrating Nazi scientists and technology. In fact, many Nazi scientists specifically specializing in exotic propulsion made their way to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base after World War II. Perhaps the most powerful general at the time, General Douglas MacArthur and his whole intelligence staff, Knights of Malta. Many of his staff displayed an unusual interest in the possibility of a quote-unquote interplanetary war, and they framed alien-related eschatology in the exact same terms Corso did. During a 1955 speech at West Point, General MacArthur told assembled cadets, "The next war will be an interplanetary war. The nations of the Earth must someday make a common front against attack by people from other planets." Chief OSS member and another CIA founder, Wild Bill Donovan, who journalist Chris Sharp notes was likely not only involved in the Magenta crash retrieval, but in setting up original protocols for UFO crash retrievals, was also a Knight of Malta. Atomic Energy Director turned CIA Director John McCone, later CIA Director Bill Casey, Knights of Malta. Remember that FDR was responsible for the communications with the Vatican about the crashed Magenta craft. Well, President Roosevelt's Vatican envoy, Myron Taylor, also a Knight of Malta. Maybe religious studies professor Diana Walsh Pasulka, who has visited the Vatican archives and speaks with conviction, that the Catholic Church knows more than meets the eye about UFOs isn't so crazy after all. Maybe she's spot on. And look at the group that are supposedly engaging in UFO crash retrievals today, JSOC, or the Joint Special Operations Command. According to journalist Seymour Hersh, one of the modern heads of JSOC, General Stanley McChrystal, and many of the members of JSOC themselves are all Knights of Malta.
Does the DOE currently work with JSOC?
We work with all of the security entities around the federal government.
Do you guys work with JSOC? Yes or no?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
There are Templars at the Vatican.
It's the residue of the truth or the myth, whatever, of Knights of the Templars.
But there are rumors that the Knights of Malta have something to do with the UFO story as well.
Well, what I'm saying is, yeah, they did, because Angleton was there.
So for context for the audience, James Jesus Angleton was sort of one of the original founders of the CIA. Dulles was sort of a mentor to him. He was a skull and bones kid and ends up in Italy. And he's kind of this eccentric, debonair, interesting guy who was also really just good at conniving and lying. And so Angleton's father, Hugh Angleton, was involved with the Knights of Malta?
He was a member.
He was a member. And so he's, wow. So he's involved in the Vatican, which makes it more likely that James Jesus Angleton probably had something to do with the retrieval of that UFO, the Magenta crash, which was kept at the Vatican.
Yeah. I'm speculating now, but no doubt in my mind about my
You're speculating, but there's so many connections. There's even a guy named John Warner IV, who is the grandson of Paul Mellon and the son of Senator John Warner. And he tells this story where he's 3 martinis in to a dinner or whatever with Paul Mellon. And Paul Mellon recalls the story. Paul Mellon's one of the founders of the CIA, and he's with Alan Dulles doing tech retrieval in, specifically, he says, I'm in Czechoslovakia, and I'm standing on top of a saucer with Alan Dulles.
And my grandfather said, look, you know, we were in a facility, a hangar, and we saw, a German flying disc. And I said, oh, is that the one that was cobbled together with 6 BMW jet engines? And he laughed and he said, no.
Basically implying that it was like this anomalous object. And right there in Czechoslovakia and modern day Poland is this thing called Kammlerstab, where Hans Kammler, the most ruthless Nazi who was doing the most kind of black world technology projects, was rumored to be working on flying saucers, and there's this rumor of this thing called Die Glocke. And so you have the Hugh Angleton connection, but you also have Dulles and Paul Mellon standing on top of this saucer. And when the Magenta object crashed, supposedly there was this partnership where Mussolini went to Hitler and was like, I don't really know what to do with this. Is this yours? And then Hitler said, no, it's not ours, but we should work on it together. We should collaborate. So there are actually a lot of data points around this. You start to build this picture up.
Well, and the
So
Italians,
Bissell said that too. That's amazing.
And the Italians, even to this day,
Yeah.
are amongst the most innovative in defense technology in the world.
That's so interesting. So maybe there's some inherited technology or
Let
something.
me tell you one factoid that is not well known in America. When we look at the world, we say the second most important military force is the UK, and especially the RAF. But they have really dwindled in importance. And I didn't know this till recently, but I'm somewhat rather actively connected with the military world. I have a book coming out with essays on geosecurity of the last 25 years that's coming up soon.
Amazing.
And anyway, no UAPs in that book. But one of the people introducing the book was the chief of the Italian Air Force. And I said, that's a little bit odd. And the editor said, no, in the Europe today, the most important Air Force besides the U.S. is the Italian Air Force. I had no idea.
Really? So they might be more advanced than meets the eye.
They were more advanced than the rest of them in Europe.
Interesting.
Yeah, this was news to me. But,
I think of Italian, I guess, the cars as being fast but unreliable. And then, but wow, the Air Force.
Yeah,
Well, Northern Italy has world-class engineering.
True.
German-level engineering. And they have it in many fields. And I always thought it was very interesting that after the Second World War, the Germans were prohibited from going into aircraft because the Luftwaffe had been such a threat. And as a result, the Germans specialized in drones. And I got into drone technology about not quite 10 years ago. And the Germans are very strong in that. And I started to also realize how strong Italian engineering. But I think this episode in history is, it's not as well understood as it could be. And I just wonder, was this part of what drove the decision to create what we now call the Axis? That because the Italians assumed that this super high-tech thing must be German, and that began their dialogue. And as they aligned, that became the Axis.
Wow.
And then again, back to George C. Marshall and the team that is basically cleaning up after the end of World War II, and the recognition that many people have knowledge of very advanced technologies. They must be brought to the United States. And that Operation Paperclip, period. And again, who's already there? It's all these cast of characters. And where have they been based? Italy.
That's amazing. It's so fascinating.
Again, there's no proof in that, but there's an interesting line of inquiry.
But there's so much corroboration. Now we have Richard Bissell to add to the Dulles Paul Mellon story, to add to David Grush's recent testimony. So we are building up this, important